I'm reading from Pete Walker's book. I've been reading chapter 12, I think it is, or 13. I'm going to continue reading. It was I started on Friday night, and I've got a bit more to do on abandonment depression. Oh, actually, yes, the map of managing abandonment depression. And the thing is that this is really to get CPTSD response under grips. And, you know, there's a lot of people out there who've been through childhood trauma who've not processed it, and a lot of dissociation and unresolved stuff going on. So I'm going to basically start reading, and if anybody comes on and they've got any questions, then I'll answer them. But I'm reading from this book, CPTSD, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. So he's talking about mindfulness, and he's talking about mindfulness and depression. And he's basically saying that deep level recovery from childhood trauma requires normalization of depression, a renunciation of the habit of reflexively reacting to it. Central to this is the development of self-compassionate mindfulness. Once again, mindfulness is the practice of staying in your body. So what happens for a lot of people who've been through trauma, they're thrown out of their bodies, so to speak, as a child. And as an adult, we need to be able to get to a place where, you know, claiming back being in our body and not being out of our body. The other thing that happens as well with childhood trauma, that whilst we basically, that being thrown out of the body as a child, because it's so shocking to be abused, means that as we go through life, we also begin to disassociate by using, you know, maybe drugs or alcohol. Not everybody, but, you know, codependent relationships and lots of things that basically distract us from our healing work. And people can even go as far as to do it with, you know, over-exercising or over-interest in spirituality or over-interest in meditation and the law of attraction, stuff like that, to bypass their original childhood pain, which has not been processed. And trauma is very difficult. Like, there's some heavy duty trauma that people have had in childhood. I'm going to continue reading from this book. It says, the practice of mindfulness cultivates our ability to stay accepting and open to our emotional and somatic experiences without retreating into a cycle of reactivity. So the reactivity that people going into fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, this is going on because, you know, people get triggered, and it's really difficult to understand how to deal with CPTSD. I mean, therapy is really important, but for me, if I didn't have this book and didn't understand how childhood trauma affected me, then I don't think I'd be at the healing place I am in my life. And again, healing is not all or nothing. It's not a one-hit wonder. It's not like you go and get healed, because we don't know when we're going to be triggered, and we don't know when we're going to have a flashback, so to speak. Reading on here, he says, Stephen Levine's beautiful book, Who Dies, is an enlightening, jargon-less and easily accessible guidebook on learning the practices of mindfulness. He says, somatic mindfulness. Because depression in CPTSD commonly morphs instantly into fear, early mindfulness work involves staying present to the physical sensations of fearful hyperarousal. This technique is also known as Sensate, I think it says, focusing, and it is the practice of feeling we explored in the last chapter. Mild sensations of fear are muscular tightness or tension anywhere in the body, especially in the alimentary canal, tension in the jaw, the throat, the chest, the diaphragm, or the belly also often correlates with fear. So we can check in with ourselves, and, you know, depending on what style we're using, whether we're using the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and whatever is our preferred go-to when we trigger. For me, it would be the flight, meaning get very flighty and just, you know, not be able to sit still and sort of hyperventilate and get really busy out of fear. And also freeze in some cases as well, which meant that, I was freezing and didn't want to see people and stuff like that. So he goes on to say that mindfulness also involves noticing the psyche wants to dissociate from these uncomfortable sensations. So when we get uncomfortable, what we'll tend to do is get really busy, or we'll fight with people, or we will freeze and we won't want to see anybody, or we'll fawn, we'll be extra nice to people. So these responses are in the video below. There's a 13 steps for managing flashbacks, and there are also 14 steps for dealing with your inner critic. And both of those things are really important in this work of complex PTSD from surviving to thriving that Pete Walker talks about. So if you haven't got the book, you'll see links below. It's currently free on Audible, USA, Amazon, on Audible, and it's also free on Kindle UK. So you can check out the links for that and see if you've got those apps that you'll be able to download it and get to work on helping yourself understand CPTSD instead of living in a life of fear and reactionary mode and, terror, or whatever goes on when we go into that state. So he also goes on to say that mindfulness also involves noticing the psyches wanting to disassociate from uncomfortable sensations. Once again, disassociation can be the classical right brain distraction of spacing out, sleeping, or the left brain cognitive distraction of worrying and obsessing. So with this book, we'll be able to see how we're handling and how we're responding and reacting to the CPTSD response that we have that's from childhood trauma. He goes on to say, over and over, the survivor will need to rescue himself from disassociation and gently bring his awareness back into fully feeling the sensations of his fear. Although sensations of fear sometimes feel unbearable at first, persistent focusing with non-reactive attention dissolves and resolves them as if awareness itself is digesting and integrating them. He goes on then to say that somatic awareness can therapeutically trigger painful memories. Somatic awareness can therapeutically trigger painful memories. Somatic awareness and sensate focusing sometimes opens up memories and unworked through feelings of grief about your child abuse and neglect. The phenomenon provides invaluable therapeutic opportunities to more fully grieve the losses of childhood. If more pain comes up, then you can digest on your own. Please consider getting someone more experienced to help you with this process. So it could be a therapist who's going to allow you to verbally ventilate, or it could be a friend that you share these things with. But we do need other people to heal CPTSD. Doing it on our own and just locking ourselves away is just not going to work. Staying away from people. So continuing reading, he says, with considerable practice, you can begin to exhume from your fear an awareness of underlying sensations of depression. These are hyper-aroused sensations that are subtle and barely perceptible at first. They may include heaviness, swollenness, exhaustion, emptiness, hunger, longing, soreness, or deadness. So we know how our body feels day to day. And generally, how the body feels links in with our emotional states. And if we don't look at what's going on inside of us, then we're not going to heal. So, Carl Jung said, not everybody knows who he is, but he worked with Freud. He was a young man. He invented, or the creator of psychoanalysis as we know it, along with Freud, that period of time. And the point is that we're here to become whole, and everybody has trauma to some degree. But the issue is childhood trauma, be it sexual abuse or violence or verbal abuse or disdain, that really affects all children on the same level. So it doesn't matter what sort of abuse it is, because some people will say that who've had verbal abuse, they'll say, or emotional abuse, they'll say, I didn't have it as bad as you had sexual abuse. And we can't measure, like a child is a child. If you imagine, you had, 4 5-year-olds in front of you, and whatever they've been through, they might have all gone through different types of abuse, but it switches children off. It puts them into developmental arrest, and they're not able to respond normally as adults as we grow up. will use our responses to protect ourselves, which we don't need to use anymore, but they're basically conditioned into us. And the only way through this is through psychoeducation and getting the help that we need so that we can get to live healthier lives and have some, peaceful moments where we're not hyperventilating, where we're not going into anxiety and panic attacks and stuff like that. I know that with this book, since I'd worked on this and I've had therapy as well, having therapy, it means that my flashbacks are a lot less severe. I'm managing them better. I tell my inner critic, the voice in my head that tells me there's something wrong with me, I tell that to bugger off. So, you'll learn things from this book that you will not learn anywhere else. And the reason I'm reading it is because the psychoeducation is needed in this world. He goes on to say, he says, these sensations are initially difficult to stay present to, as those of fear. With ongoing practice, however, focused attention also digests them as they are integrated into consciousness. So what we're doing is we're integrating our wound, so our wound no longer controls us or runs us. And that will mean grieving, healthy anger, healthy blame. It will mean tears. It's work to do this, to heal, but it's worth it. If you took a year and a half to do this, in a year and a half's time, your life would be very, very different. It happened to me, so I can vouch for it. He goes on to say, one of the biggest challenges of mindfully focusing on depression is to not disassociate into it with sleep. Sitting up straight in a comfortable chair can help you to awake and focus on fully feeling, metabolizing your depression. So we've got to feel the depression, and then when we feel it and we're taking notice of it, it will begin to lift. The same with fear. If we look at the fear, instead of just feeling fear, if we sit there and say, what is this fear? Where is it in my body? Where am I feeling it? So it's experiencing it and looking at it objectively. And that takes work to get to the point where you begin to do it naturally. But if you begin it as a practice, he says, as practice becomes more accomplished, these feelings and sensations of depression can morph into a sense of peace, relaxation, and ease. On special occasions, they sometimes open up to underlying innate care, emotional experience of clarity, well-being, and belonging. Okay. Introspective somatic work. He says, I began my journey of learning how to feel by devoting half an hour a day to feeling the sensations of my fear. So that's an idea. If we sat for 15 minutes and thought, how am I feeling? What is this fear? What is this depression? As an example, he said he did half an hour a day. He said, this was extremely difficult because I had survived my childhood with ADHD-like busyness. I had run daily marathons of activity to keep myself one step ahead of my fear and my shame-saturated depression. As an adult, I reduced this to half marathons, but I was still a busyholic despite my relaxed persona. Tuning into how wired I was daunting. In my attempts to become more mindful, I was also often exasperated by how frequently my awareness fled my body and went back into thinking or daydreaming. So we can watch ourselves. Some of us have a natural disposition. I've seen this in astrology charts. I study something called evolutionary astrology, which also helps people to look at their wounds and heal and objectify. It's like a form of, it's not psychoanalysis, but it's a form of like analysis of self, because if we went back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before television and mobile phones and Facebook and stuff like that, people would have sat around under the stars with, by fires, eating food, talking, looking at the stars and contemplating on their life and looking at their life problems. Now we're so, we don't give ourselves time to sit and just feel what we're feeling. So we can be very wound up in the body, and we're not really relaxing and releasing what we need to release. He goes on to say, I lost myself. My critic repeatedly, he says, I was assailed by a plethora of catastrophizing thoughts and visualizations. My critic repeatedly misinterpreted my fear as if I was still entrapped in my hazardous family. So all of that fear generally that you're feeling as an adult, and the upset and the toxic shame, all of those things will feed into the body and make the body act out. And a lot of people as well who've been through trauma have physical, ailments, which as you begin to work on this stuff through psychoeducation, your body will begin to heal and you'll get more mindful about what you're doing to your body. I'll give you an example. I recently decided I wasn't having processed sugar for a month, and I'm on the 1st of June. And when the month was up, it's now turned into 6 weeks. I've had no processed sugar. So we can see that I got more mindful. I thought wanted to know what sugar was doing to my moods. And I'm glad I've done it. And I don't really feel that I need to go back to sugar. So it's been an interesting one for me. A big move I did there. So he goes on to say, my critic, he says, goaded me incessantly to launch into flight mode. I was itching to get going, that I had strange, tantalizing fantasies of cleaning my apartment, normally one of my least favorite things to do. In the first year of this practice, I frequently had to white knuckle the handles of my chair to stay somatically present in my feelings. Otherwise, I would have been off and running into self-medicating and excessive adrenalization. So I hope you get this, whoever's listening out there, what that means. And I've got a ladies group over on Facebook for any ladies that watch, and because there's a lot of privacy there. And for the guys that watch this, I know a few groups that are anxiety, PTSD related, CPTSD, that I can put you in touch with on Facebook if you private message me on Facebook or write a message below the video. Continuing reading, he says, dissolving depression by fully feeling it. He said, gradually my awareness began to metabolize my fear. Many months later, I was typically able to relax the tense, fearful sensations of a flashback within 10 minutes. So now I can go into flashback. I used to have flashbacks that would last for weeks on end. And now I have one and it will last half an hour, which is amazing. And, and then that means I don't go into panic attacks and deep anxiety. And, and this is this education from this book. He says, I became more successful at digesting my fear. I experientially discovered the rock bottom underlying core sensation of my abandonment depression itself. Mindful merging with the subtle emotions and sensations of depression is the finishing tool of deconstructing self-abandonment. Over and over, I focused on the sensations of my depression. Occasionally, these sensations were intense, but more often they were very subtle. Often, it was difficult to resist the urge to fall asleep, and many times I could not. At other times, I noticed how instantly my depression scared me back into fear. Simultaneously, the sensations of depression also triggered me into toxic shame. So you can be doing well, going along and, taking 2 steps forward, and then you might feel a bit depressed for half an hour. But we have lots of normal feelings, but we label them quite seriously. And if we really sat there and just felt them out and, cried a few tears and then feel better, we surpass it, but we want to be fixed and we can cling on to these emotions. And we don't, the more we know that we don't have to do that, and we overcome it. So continuing, he says, at other times I noticed how instantly my depression scared me back into fear. Simultaneously, the sensations of depression also triggered me into toxic shame. Often, I would witness myself echoing my parents' contempt. Bad, lazy, worthless, good for nothing, stick in the mud, etc., etc. So also for people who've been through childhood abuse, you might see, if you begin to look, that the voice in your head that shames you and tells you that you're worthless is not your voice. It's come from, and this can happen at bullying, if you've been bullied at school, or aunts, uncles. It's not just always parents. It can be, any sort of adult, or even, at school or something, like younger people who've been traumatized by other people. He goes on to say, blessedly, with ongoing practice, I gradually learned to disidentify from the toxic vocabulary of the critic. And I've done that too. I've disidentified with my inner critic. So, some days I think I look in the mirror and I think, oh, I look really good today and I feel really good. And then some days I look in the mirror or I make a YouTube video and I think, oh my God, I look crap today, or I'm not good enough, or, I didn't read it that well. But I get rid of that inner critic now. I tell it to bugger off, because we're all human. We're all having a human experience. Nobody's absolute perfection. Everybody contains some form of beauty in them. And we've got to look deeper and see, we don't look at children, like our inner child, and think it's, it's ugly and there's something wrong with it. We don't look at babies that way. So we've got to stop looking at ourselves that way. We've got to start working with our own inner child and embracing that inner child. And for me, I found that really hard, because the idea of being a child was traumatic, and, there was a lot of ugliness involved in that, in the emotional states and the feelings and the things that happened. And it went on for so long. And I think that the word mother and father for me were a trigger, because of what I'd experienced. So we all have different experiences, but we need to look at what works for us. And if we can work with our inner child and begin to love it and give it space to have joy, and also to have its moods and little strops, then we're going to really be helping ourselves. So then he says, blessedly, with ongoing practice, I gradually learned to disidentify from the toxic vocabulary of the critic. I also learned to stay awake most of the time, awake. I then found myself more accurately naming these revisited childhood feelings: small, helpless and lonely, unsupported and unloved. Over time, this in turn rewarded me with a profound sense of compassion for the abandoned child I was. So what we're aiming for is that inner child that was not loved or abused or whatever went on, is getting to a place of deep compassion for that inner child. Because when we have deep compassion for that inner child, then we will have it for ourselves, and then we project that out into the world also, and we'll start having deep compassion for others. And then when we do that, generally we receive it back. I mean, clearly the world's not a completely safe place, but there are more people are safe than are unsafe. And the more we look after ourselves, then we actually begin to also make, as our self-esteem increases, we make better choices for ourselves. And if we choose people who, are abusive or unkind to us, then we will nip it in the bud a lot quicker. We won't just continue in codependent, unpleasant, abusive relationships. We'll say, hey, I'd rather, I can be on my own now, because we don't feel abandoned. So this book, and all the links are below. And it's free on Audible. So check out those links below. It's free on USA and Amazon and Kindle UK. So then he goes on, he says, moreover, I made the wonderful discovery that sensate focusing, when it had been well practiced and developed, is the ultimate thought-stopping technique. When the critic is especially loud and persistent, shifting your awareness from thinking to feeling your sensations is a potent way of coming home to a safer place. It is, as one survivor told me, coming home to rest in the mother of your body. So it's the inner mother. And funnily enough, actually, in astrology at the moment, there's been a solar eclipse. There was a solar eclipse on the 2nd of July, and that was in the sign of Cancer, and the lunar eclipse is going to be in the sign of Capricorn. And the beauty of this is that society right now, this is what it's about. It's about evolving into loving ourselves, and also where the planet Chiron is. Like, I look at astrology charts and it just shows so much of how this healing is, taking place in humanity, because we're all trying to evolve. Like all of the sexual abuses and violence, it's sort of come to a point where, if you look back to Hollywood a couple of years ago when the Me Too movement started, I'm not a follower of that. I'm not advocating following anything, but I am advocating reading this book. And I think that, society, then we had, the Michael Jackson case, which, we do, whether we know or don't know, nobody knows apart from the children that were in that room. And we can argue about such things. But the ultimate thing is, and then the Catholic Church with all of the abuses towards children. So what's happening in society, we are actually evolving, and we're evolving into a place where it's not okay, to abuse children. It's not okay to have sex with children. It's not okay. Somebody was telling me, which was quite interesting, I didn't know this, that in the UK that paedophilia is outlawed, and some other countries, clearly in Europe, but somebody was telling me that in certain states in America, it's not, where, very young children are married off, like, 12 or 13-year-olds are married off. And we have this in other places in the world, maybe in parts of Africa, and, maybe, I don't know all the history, but when we begin to look at the reality, that what goes on, and the mind of, when I say man, the mind of man, I don't mean men, I mean the consciousness, our consciousness as human beings, how far we've come, but how far we have to go as well. And that people standing up and speaking up and getting rid of the toxic shame and reclaiming self-esteem, particularly those who've been through, tragic abuse, means that we are also helping the children coming through. And this, so it's a really important, we're really important, us right now, us that have been through it, because also we've got the relational skills, because we've been through this. We can put ourselves down quite badly when we've been through abuse and just think we're bits of, a bit of rubbish or something, and we're not good enough. But the reality is that we've often got more relational skills, because we understand depths that other people have not been to. And, it's, it can become a gift. It's become a gift. I'm not saying it's become a gift, like, wow, that happened and it's become a gift, but that somewhere in there, there's something through the pain that I've been through in my life. There's something, that beautiful that's come out of it. And I've got to a point where I'm not abandoning myself anymore, and I'm looking after myself. I'm now doing work that I love after, a business I was in for 29 years. I lost that due to severe breakdown, a business I started at 21. So we can see that, losses and the pain can evolve into something really, really special. And we owe it to ourselves to do this inner work. It's very hard for many people to approach solely on their own. So I do have that group over on Facebook for the ladies, and got, the book, the links are below. It will be life-changing, hard work, but life-changing. So going on, he says, in my current everyday recovery work, I most commonly apply this mindful technique to experience of the survival mode depression. For me, this low-grade manifestation of the abandonment depression typically gets triggered by a few nights of poor sleep, which often decreases my energy levels and dulls my ability to concentrate. Most of my life, this feeling experience provided rich fodder for my critic. Over the years, however, increased mindfulness allows me to see that I typically function well enough, no matter how tired or introverted I feel. These days, I am sometimes even able to authentically welcome the most exhausted of these experiences as a chance to take a break from my less essential routines. I have learned how to resist my critic's all or none productivity program and be satisfied with days of getting less done. We're not here to run around like headless chickens. I mean, we've all got this idea, I'm going to be really successful, I'm going to build a big business, I'm going to whatever, have the perfect relationship. We live in such delusions, and we're so unkind to ourselves. And this is people who've not been through abuse as well. They want perfectionism, they want the perfect partner, they want, it's a nightmare being human for many. But yes, we'll keep healing as we go. So I'm going to read a bit more from this book. He says, hunger as camouflage depression. So this will be, for me, when I get like that, I undereat. I undereat, meaning that I wouldn't eat, enough. So we're all different. We handle these things differently. And when I had a breakdown in 2016, and I was 125 pounds. I lost 20, and then and then because I wasn't getting the nutrition, my hair began to fall. It was a nightmare. So, you know, we have to look after ourselves, and it's okay that that breakdown point was very poignant for me, because it turned me around. It got me to be angry with my abuse instead of feeling guilty, which is chronic with people who've been through abuse, particularly early abuse. They can think that, you know, sexual abuse or violence or cruelty, children can believe somewhere, even in us as adults, we believe that we did something that made the parent or the carer or whoever cruel to us, that we did something that made them, you know, want to touch us sexually, or to, you know, beat us. Some people even say things like, well, you know, they got hit, and they make light of it, you know, that, well, they got hit too. It's like, well, you know, it's not acceptable. You know, where do we break this chain as human beings? Is it, you know, is it okay to hit a small little person? I don't think so. It's a very odd one, but clearly we're changing, and it might take hundreds of years for people to really get it, but we're on track for some changes. And the authority, you know, the governments, the people, you know, who look after children in children's homes and stuff like that, you know, where people are abused in under care systems, chronic. So anyway, he goes on. He says, hunger as camouflage to depression. He said, feelings of abandonment commonly masquerade as the psychological sensations of hunger. Hunger pain soon after a big meal is rarely truly about food. Typically, it is camouflaged emotional hunger and the longing for safe, nurturing connection. Food cannot satisfy the hunger pain of abandonment. Only loving support can do that. That means we need some good people around us as well. So we have to start choosing and watching people. If we've got friends who say toxic things to us, or do toxic things to us, or maybe toxic is too strong a word, I don't know, but, you know, friends need to be loving, you know, to quite a high degree. We all have our moods, but we can say, I'm in a mood today, or whatever. We don't need to berate and be horrible to each other, or allow it, more to the point. Going on, he says, only loving support can. He says, Janine Roth's book offers powerful self-help on this subject. So for anybody who's got the eating thing out there, he says, he's mentioned a name there. He says, even after a decade of practice, I still find it difficult to differentiate this type of attachment hunger from physical hunger. One often reliable clue is that the sensation of longing for nourishment of attachment is usually in my small intestine, while physical hunger locus is a little higher up in my stomach. When I can take the time to mediate on this lower abdomen sensation, I often become aware that I am in a low-level flashback. Feeling, though, through this comfortable sensation typically resolves both the flashback and my false hunger. I'll tell you something there. When I stopped my sugar, like processed sugar, on the 1st of June, the first 3 days, because I had a little cake every night for years after I stopped drinking in 2012, which a bottle of wine a night, that's basically filled with sugar, ultimately. So it's like a sugar hit. So when I stopped, I'd buy a little cake every night from a nice little pastry shop near me, or a cake shop. And when I stopped, the first 3 days, I did feel very emotional and a bit tearful because I didn't have my cake. And then I was happy to continue doing that, even though it was difficult. But about a week ago, I had this gnawing in my, you know, in my stomach somewhere, but it wasn't hunger, but it was a feeling of, it felt uncomfortable. So I think that that's what he's relating to. It's like checking in with your stomach, you know, that area, which is actually our second brain, you know, that keeps us, you know, alive in the respect that the nutrients, you know, that we put into us, you know, go throughout the body. And I think that, you know, I'm glad that I listened to what was going on, because that feeling passed. Like if I listened to it, I would have gone out and bought some chocolate a few weeks ago or whatever. But I didn't. I stayed with it, and that feeling dissipated. And I think the feeling that I was experiencing was a bit of abandonment or a bit of loneliness. So very interesting what he just said there on food, worth thinking into. He goes on to say, I believe this type of emotional hunger is at the core of most food addictions. And I would say that, you know, with alcohol addiction, that was definitely, you know, I was covering something up there. I was self-medicating. He says, one of the reasons food addictions are so difficult to manage is that food was the first source of self-comfort available to us. And if you think about that, like children don't go for alcohol when they're little children, they go for little biscuits and treats and ice cream to comfort them. If you watch children around you, you know, that's what they want. I want my ice cream. It's like, you know, it's feeding them some sort of comfort. Then he goes on to say, with the dearth of any other comfort, there is little wonder that we came to over-rely on eating for nurturance. So a lot of us can look at eating for nurturance or not eating enough as well, you know, not nurturing ourselves. That's another form of sort of self-punishment as well. Going on, he says, in fact, like Gabor Mate, that he's got some brilliant videos actually, Gabor Mate, I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. He says, I believe that attachment hunger is at the core of most addictive behavior, even process addictions. An example of the latter is the sex and love addict's desperate pursuit of high intensity relating. Perhaps all addictive behavior is our misguided attempts to self-medicate deeper abandonment pain and unmet attachment needs. So if we've not had our needs met, then we found it from somewhere else. I mean, that's what goes on. So what I'm going to do, it's quite late here, I'm in London. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm just counting the pages, 7. There's 8 more pages of this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come back tomorrow evening and I'm going to continue the last bit of this chapter. The bit before I read on Friday, and then this bit, just to remind you, here's the book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. So go and check the links out below and print off the 13 steps for managing flashbacks, which is going to get you to see what's going on there, and also the 14 inner critic attacks, because we need to hear that voice and start getting rid of it, because until that voice is gone, we're not able to really evolve. We need to get rid of the inner critic that tells us that we're worthless, that we're not good enough, that we don't look good enough, that we're not where we think we should be, and the multitude of things that the inner critic does, which is not our voice. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. Just to let you know that anybody watching these, I don't see who's on unless people comment. So it's a good platform to, you know, have your anonymity and get some psychoeducation. But please do get the book, check it out. And I'll be back tomorrow evening and do a bit more. Catch you later. Thank you.